Why does it matter if the person gets the code that they need at a price that they think is fair?
You can vibe code up a demo to demonstrate any feature or any product idea that you have. So turn up with something that works.
For someone who doesn't work in that industry, that stuff was really shiny and sexy and appealing.
Hello world and welcome to the Tech Overflow podcast. My name is Hugh Williams.
And I'm Hannah Clayton-Langton, and we are the podcast that breaks down technology for curious people.
How'd I do, Hannah?
You did great. That felt weird. Guys, we decided to do some A/B testing and mix up who does the intro. So if we get much more listens and engagement on this episode, we'll make that a permanent swap.
Or we'll try another experiment, one word each or something. I'm not too sure.
And guys, this is a signal that I am now an official tech expert and I will be leading this episode as our resident technical guru.
Yeah, so our topic today, Hannah, is transistors, the evolution of the transistor. So tell us about transistors. When were they first invented?
Okay, correct. I've been outed pretty quickly. Okay, we will do an episode on transistors later on, let's say season 7. I'm not yet a technical expert, but I may well be by then. So no, we're not talking about transistors today, guys. We are talking about big tech.
Yeah, obviously I spent a lot of my career working in big tech, so I'm really excited, Hannah, to talk about all the companies, the West Coast tech, a little bit about Taiwan, China, and really give our smart listeners out there some insight into how these companies operate.
Guys, my goal for this episode is to get Hugh to spill as many secrets as I can about Silicon Valley, so wish me luck in that endeavor. I reckon we get straight into it because I really want to mine you for gossip. So no episode about big tech would be complete without a reference to the Magnificent Seven. So those are the 7 biggest tech companies in the US, publicly listed, I guess, biggest tech companies in the US. And I'm sure you can do this, but I'm going to ask you to name all 7 to kick us off.
Yeah, so Apple, of course, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, which owns Google, amongst other things, also owns Waymo, we did an episode on in season 1. Meta, which of course owns Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. NVIDIA, which make the GPUs that we've talked a lot about in season 1, and Tesla.
Ding, ding, ding. Got them all right. So they make up, I think, about 30% of the S&P 500, which is the US's largest 500 publicly listed companies. There'll be a few on there that listeners will know that we haven't mentioned just because they're not publicly listed. So like OpenAI, Anthropic, right? They're not. Yeah,
SpaceX. I mean, there's quite a few large companies that, may publicly list in sometime in the near future. But they're the major ones that are publicly listed. And Magnificent Seven's a new moniker, if you like. It hasn't been around that long. We used to use the moniker FANG, which had 2 A's in it, which I think is Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. They were the cool kids on the block probably 5 years ago, but now we talk about the Magnificent Seven instead.
Interesting. So Netflix dropped out, and I'm surprised that you didn't mention Microsoft. I would have thought they would have been in there.
They had a really big comeback, really under Satya Nadella's leadership, and the Azure business is a very, very big business. They're cloud business, and we talked about cloud a little bit in season 1, particularly in our wrap episode. And also, they've been major investors in AI. They're a large shareholder of OpenAI famously. And so, they've really made a comeback, and so they're part of the Magnificent Seven.
Interesting that you mentioned cloud, because I did a little bit of research on the revenue streams of the Magnificent Seven, and some of it's quite intuitive and some of it's a bit surprising. So yeah, Microsoft, a lot of the profit driven by cloud. Speaking of cloud, I was surprised to learn that I think it's something like 75 or 80% of Amazon's revenue is still coming from their retail business, but their profit margin is mainly driven by AWS. So things like cloud, I assume, are a much better play than, selling bits and bobs online to consumers, but then the retail business becomes the volume play.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, low margin, high volume business, the retail business. And then because of the scale of AWS and the ability that, you can really get scale from that infrastructure, the margins are much, much, much higher. And they really are the company that largely sits under most other companies that you're using on your smartphone or on the web.
And Google have got a cloud business, but I think something like 90% of their revenue comes from ads, which I think we're going to talk a little bit more about Google in an upcoming episode, but that's not a huge surprise given the power that sits behind their data collection.
One of the best business models, Hannah, of all time is certainly the Google Ads business.
Well, we actually should do a whole episode on that.
We will.
And then I was interested to learn that Tesla actually make 10 to 15% of their revenue on like environmental credits, which I assume is just sort of a way for less environmentally friendly companies to offset some of their emissions, like the sort of old school car production companies or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And look, historically, Tesla certainly benefited a lot from, government credits, government programs, support, those kinds of things. So it's a complex company. Obviously, it's building in its end product something that's incredibly environmentally friendly, an electric car and batteries that can be used to power all kinds of things. Long conversation about whether the actual production of the car and the batteries is environmentally friendly. I think that's a separate conversation, but certainly they've benefited a lot from, regulatory and government support. Obviously, a lot of that's been wound back by the Trump administration.
We won't get into politics overflow on this podcast. So find us in the pub for that conversation. Microsoft's an interesting one because I don't know how widely known their investment in OpenAI is sort of outside of the tech world. And also, less sexy than ChatGPT, but they own LinkedIn, which I only learned when I was prepping for this episode.
Yeah. Look, and, they own, I think, 49% of OpenAI. And, I think they've owned LinkedIn since probably around 2016, Hannah.
That is correct. And they bought it. Can you guess how much for?
Look, my mind's saying $9 billion, but I bet it's a little bit more than that.
It was $26 billion, which anyway.
Off by an order of magnitude, that's me.
Well, I would have guessed much lower. Anyway, so some interesting sort of makeup of the revenue of those companies. You can certainly, dig a bit deeper. We won't get into that any further for now. And then, of course, the Magnificent Seven, those are all by nature US based. We do see a huge amount of big tech innovation come from the West Coast of the US, and we can talk about why that is maybe a bit later on, but maybe a nod to Taiwan for the semiconductor production. So TSMC, I believe that company's called. And then we've got ByteDance, who own TikTok and are famously based in China. More on them later. And I think it's probably fair to call out Samsung in Korea. Do you think we've missed any?
Yeah, we've probably missed quite a few. There's a lot of large Chinese companies, Alibaba, Tencent. There's a long list. We should do an episode on Chinese tech. And then, there's companies that aren't as large as those that are based outside the US that are pretty famous. So, an example might be Spotify. Swedish.
That's it. I didn't realize for a long time that they were Swedish. I think that's super cool.
But on TSMC, they are the company that really produces the silicon for most of the Magnificent Seven. So, the supply chain from Taiwan is very, very important to US tech. And again, that's probably a topic we could dig into in a future season.
Yeah, definitely. The geopolitics of it suddenly become quite scary. But that's not what we're going to focus on today. So I want to take us back to the West Coast of the US because that's where, Hugh, you spent a lot of your career. But why do you think we got these hubs of huge tech innovation coming out of Seattle as well as California? I was going to say maybe it was the weather, but I think the weather in Seattle's a bit crap. But why do you think those hubs ended up there? Is it just because it's where Bill Gates was from?
The Microsoft story is really the Seattle story, and it's probably not super well known. You can read about it in Bill Gates' latest book, which is called Source Code. Microsoft's early years were really in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then Bill and Paul Allen decided to actually move the headquarters back to Seattle, which is where they famously both were from. So it was almost an Albuquerque, New Mexico business before, for a while there, it became the center of tech in the US.
Amazon is Seattle too, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's a beneficiary of the fact that Microsoft was there and really turned Seattle into a tech destination.
Because once you get a critical mass of good engineers, I assume, is mostly what are in demand, then you want to co-locate so you can try and steal that good talent, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you work in any of these companies, you'll find that there's a significant number of people who've been there for their whole life, but most of the other people would come from one of these other large tech companies. So there's lots of people at Google who are from Microsoft, lots of people at Microsoft who are from Google, Facebook, these folks just move around.
Okay, so Seattle, that sort of makes sense. And then we travel down the coast to California. Why do you think that built up?
Yeah, we fly over Oregon and get to California.
Funny that, not a huge hub of tech globally, Oregon.
Yeah, and if you ever lived in California or been to California, you know that it's really two states. So they call it Northern California or NorCal and Southern California or SoCal. And, they're really different places. Arguably, it could be two states. You kind of rule a line across the middle. And LA is perhaps famous for the film industry and all those kinds of things, the music industry. So very, very different culture to the culture you would find in the Bay Area, which is the area just below San Francisco, which is, famously known, I suppose, outside of the Bay Area as the Silicon Valley. So you'll find that people inside the so-called Silicon Valley just call it the Bay Area, and the rest of the world calls it the Silicon Valley. But I think the history really is that You had Stanford University, obviously one of the, a world-class university. It's always been very, very good at computer science. And so it's always produced top-shelf graduates. Larry and Sergey, who founded Google, are, Stanford folks. So lots of famous people have come out of Stanford and gone on to found companies, but it's historically been a very, very strong school for computer science. Defense was also based sort of in that region. So there's lots of defense industry there. Climate's great. Back in the day, there was plenty of land, lots of fruit orchards. And so, you put together the universities with the defense investment, with a wonderful climate, plenty of land. And the end result is it became really the center of tech in the world.
Okay. So it literally comes down to accessibility of smart graduates. I know from having worked with robotics through my current job that there's like a big hub around Boston for similar reasons. You've got like Harvard and Tufts and Boston College and some of the really good unis. So it sort of makes sense that that's where the employers gravitate to. And what years were you in? You were like early Silicon Valley, right? Is that fair?
No, not fair at all. No, the Silicon, no. I'm not,
Maybe we take that out.
I'm definitely the senior member of the team here, but I'm not quite that senior.
Okay, so what years were you in Silicon Valley, aka the Bay Area?
Yeah, so we moved to the Bay Area in 2009, and I was there until 2017. So just a small part of the history of the so-called Silicon Valley.
But that was a really big, so maybe just since you've mentioned timelines, just to place sort of what was going on in the world of tech, because I found this quite interesting as it came out of my research. But if we think about the history of what tech meant, right? Because back in the day, so in the 1980s, let's say, it was all about personal computing. The internet wasn't really a thing yet, or not something that the everyday person was using. And then the 90s was all about the internet boom. I literally remember the first time we crowded around my dad's desk, actually also in the US, and dialed up to the internet with that very distinctive sound. If you know, you know. 2000 to 2010 was all about social media. And then we moved into apps and the app economy and app for everything. And now when we talk about tech, we're really talking about like cloud, generative AI, platform tech. So through that time period, tech as an industry meant quite different things depending on what was going on. So you were there during the sort of social media, mobile and app economy phase of things.
Yeah, that's it. And probably the birth of cloud computing, really, as it became something that became commoditized and available to other companies around the world. And we've spoken a little bit about it in earlier episodes, Hannah, where we've talked about sort of how Microsoft built its own cloud for its own purposes, and in its case for Bing, and Google did the same for its Google search. And Amazon did the same for its store. And then obviously they went on and sold those things to other people. And that's really now what powers the internet. But certainly I was there for the mobile revolution, probably some part of the web revolution, and definitely the cloud revolution.
And does that change the type of people, like computer scientists, that you need? Do you need different skills, or is it all covered in a computer science degree?
Yeah, really good question, Hannah. I mean, if you zoom out a lot, right, I think at the beginning of computing, it was all about hardware, and, software was a small part. Certainly over time, what's happened is hardware's become, it's still interesting, but the real money has gone into software. Look, I think a good computer science degree gives you fundamental problem-solving skills that you can use to adapt to any new technology. So that's one of the wonderful things about doing computer science is you learn how to be a problem solver. You learn how to decompose a problem down into smaller problems and solve those problems. We talked a little bit about that way back in our first episode of season 1. So, at least on paper, I guess somebody with a computer science degree ought to be able to adapt to changes in technology. But I say on a more practical level, the kinds of skills that are valuable has changed quite a lot. I mean, there was certainly a phase when, maybe we'll just go back to the start of the web, where being a web developer, somebody who could build web pages and make those interactive, was kind of the hot skill. Then being an app developer became a very valuable skill. If you could write iPhone apps or Android apps, that was a valuable skill. Again, that's a little bit more commoditized now, especially with things like Claude Code, where you can generate large swaths of code. And these are often very simple apps to build. Then we sort of went through a phase of where the sort of really infrastructure people who could stitch together AWS and Azure and Google's cloud to really build scalable systems were very valuable. Those folks are still quite valuable. But I think what we've really seen over the last few years is the emergence of the data scientist. So these are people who can use data to create products, and they're often people who are very skilled at machine learning and AI, and obviously that is the topic du jour, if you like, of computer science at the moment.
Yeah, I wonder how that will develop. If you think about it, like if someone works for 40, 45 years in their career, that's spanning a lot of different eras within tech. And so I guess you either have to be, super committed to the thing that you do, even if it becomes out of fashion in sort of the main, or you have to be pretty agile, right? And like, would people retrain?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the programming languages that I learned at university are largely not used anymore. So certainly, through my career, I've had to adapt to different programming languages, different ways of building software. Pretty much everything's changed. But again, if you've got those fundamental computer science characteristics, you ought to be able to, adapt to change over time. And that's why I always say to people, when we're hiring, we should be hiring for fundamental sort of competencies, if you like. Is a person a good problem solver? Are they smart? Are they driven? Have they got a computer science degree? Not hiring for somebody who has a specific skill, because skills come and go very, very quickly in the tech industry.
Okay, so these highly skilled problem solvers that you were drawing in from top universities on the west coast of the US, they're getting paid a lot of money, right? Like if you're working in tech, if you're an engineer, there's sort of two paths you can go down. Maybe this is my outside in view, and you can go for like the lifestyle, work remotely from a beach, get paid pretty good money considering that you're sort of in control and have the flexibility, or you can go after like cold hard cash and land a job in the Silicon Valley and make a lot of money.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think there's lots of things you can do in tech, but certainly if you want to be amongst the best of the best and be paid the largest amount possible, then, being in the Silicon Valley is the way to go.
And it's not just like monetary compensation. Like Netflix famously have unlimited holiday. And I know that Google support female employees freezing their eggs, which is actually a really awesome benefit that I have a couple of friends that have taken them up on it. Free food. I remember I once worked at YouTube early on in my career. I wasn't working for YouTube, but we did an event with YouTube, and it was like going into the Google offices and seeing that they do actually have the nap pods and the massage room and the free food that you can just take from the canteen. Like for someone who doesn't work in that industry, that stuff was like really shiny and sexy and appealing.
Yeah, and look, at all of it's true. Certainly when I worked at Google, I worked at the Mountain View campus, so the main campus of Google. I think it probably had around 50 different restaurants.
Wow.
Not all of them open for all meals, but, they had breakfast, lunch and dinner. Pretty much select any cuisine you want any time of the day. So I used to hit the gym. They probably had, more than 25 gyms. They'd sort of done a faux athletics track with the synthetic grass and things. They had big tractor tires there that you could flip over, hammers that you could hit things with, put out sort of the cones and have running drills, a bit sort of boot camp kind of style. I used to enjoy that. And when I finished the class, go and have a shower and with the free towels, of course, that come with the experience. And then I'd head over to one of the smoothie stations and get them to make me up a really, really good protein smoothie with all the additives that I wanted. Usually for lunch, I'd pick one of the healthier options, quite like one of the Japanese restaurants they had, used to go there. And then I didn't usually stick around for dinner. I'd jump on my bike and pedal home. But certainly, the culture is designed to get you in there early, so you get a free breakfast, feed you at lunchtime, and then get you to stay late, have dinner, stick around, maybe do a little bit more work. So, the culture is designed to get you to work hard by providing you with the perks to help you do that.
Okay, I would be such a sucker to that culture. Like if you give me a good gym I'll be there on the weekend. Like that is very smart. Yeah. I'll take us for a minute a little bit further away geographically, but my brother worked for ByteDance in China for a while.
Oh, wow.
And I asked him for some of the sort of insights into how I was working there, because they worked him pretty hard. I think he was there for 2 or 3 years. And he said similar things. So it was like core working hours were 10 till 7, I think, but free breakfast was from 9 and free dinner was from 7. So it's like
996 as they call it, Hannah.
Yes, that's it. Sorry, I should have opened with that. Beijing tech is the 996. So you work 9 till 9, 6 days a week.
Yeah.
Actually, sorry, just on the 6 days a week thing, he said that when he moved to work at ByteDance, they were just changing from working 6-day weeks every week to working a 6-day week and then a 5-day week the following week. Wow. And they did something really cheeky where they were like, oh, we were actually paid double for Saturday, so you're going to get more than 1/6 of your pay cut on the weeks that you are only doing 5 days. And he said that some people really didn't like that because they just actually wanted to work super hard. He said there was a ton of young people who worked there basically until they burnt out. And then he said they got subsidized rent, but only as long as it was within 20 minutes of the office or something. So he didn't go for that one. He actually said that it inflated the rents in the local area, and so it wasn't really worth it. But it was that whole design of like, it sounds really cool, and someone like me who wants a convenient gym will be like immediately bought in, but it's basically designed to keep you on site and working for as much of the day as possible, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the Google story, I mean, they had pretty much had every service you could possibly think of, and those were free. So they had like a bike repair store. You could, if you had an issue with your bike, you could take your bike there and they'd repair it for you while you're at work, laundry, all these kinds of things.
Dry cleaning?
Yeah, certainly dry cleaning. I can't remember whether it was free or not, but certainly they had, dry cleaning where they'd come and pick it up and drop it back, and, probably subsidized at the very, very least. But certainly, every service you needed to reasonably live your life was available on the campus, again, to get you to stay on the campus. The only thing they didn't have was beds, so you couldn't actually sleep overnight there.
Okay, and did they have like childcare and or pet care? Like sometimes you see that like doggy daycare is in London, like dog friendly offices is a big pull for certain people.
Yeah, so certainly, all of those things are thought of. So if you sort of zoom out a little bit and think about sort of the broader benefits package for somebody working at Google, I mean, certainly they want you and your family to be happy. So the health benefits are fantastic, and a lot of things like, looking after your pet, childcare, those kinds of things are all pretty heavily supported. And obviously because it's one of the most wealthy places in the world, there's an enormous number of workers who come into that area to provide those kinds of services. So it's definitely the center of the universe when it comes to sort of being looked after, both within the company and also, broadly as a family that lives there.
And do you get the same perks if you're like a receptionist or like a finance manager? Do you get the same perks as the engineers?
Yes and no. I think there's different colored badges. And so, the employees get a badge that's one color and the contractors get a badge that's a different color, and you get virtually no perks if you are a contractor. And you would find, for example, that pretty much all the receptionists are going to be contracted through a firm. And so they're wonderful people. They work hard, they share the ethos, but they don't get any of the benefits really that the employees get.
I had heard that because Google have got big offices in London, that they mainly hire people at least to start on fixed term contracts. And I had understood that was because it's easier to sort of end the relationship with the employee if it's not gone well, and then they can just make you permanent if it does. But I hadn't considered that's probably also a benefits play.
Yeah, look, it probably is. And look, California has what we call at-will employment. And that basically means that they can get rid of you or you can quit, and you can do that fairly quickly. Obviously, places like the UK and Australia, it's a lot more difficult to get rid of employees. And, sometimes, particularly in the UK, hard for an employee to leave. So,
yeah.
Some of the senior executives in UK tech have to give crazy notice periods that,
like 12 months, right?
Yeah, just completely blow my mind. Where, I think the longest I've probably ever seen in the US West Coast is probably 3 weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Wow. Even UK, the shortest you'll get is 1 month. And back to these different colored badges, because I'm kind of shook by this. Okay, so does that create like a 2-tier? Do the engineers, who I presume are the people on the permanent contracts, like does that make them sort of like first class citizens, and then the other ones like maybe less so?
Yeah, I think uncomfortably so.
Wow. Okay, so we've kind of got a 2-tier system. And so would your like in-house lawyers be contractors, or would they be full-time?
No, they'd be full-time. Though things like patent lawyers, the folks who write up the patent applications and things, would be external legal firms. So when it comes to sort of some of the specialist legal functions, they use well-known external firms. But certainly all of the professional staff who are paid well are full-time employees.
Okay, and it's obviously paired with like caning the working hours, right? Like I imagine if you are a very highly paid engineer at one of the big tech firms, the expectations on you are pretty high. And what you've said about at-will employment means that can all be ended pretty quickly by an employer if they don't feel like they're getting the value from you.
Yeah, these are performance cultures for sure. And I think most of these companies are, by any measure, world-class at setting, KPIs or performance requirements of the people that work there. They, by and large, have pretty strong review cultures. So, you sit down and you talk about your performance. They have very strong bonus cultures where they'll pay bonuses or not pay bonuses based on people's performance. And so certainly these are cultures where, people are encouraged to work hard towards very specific goals. And, if you don't hit those goals, you might not get your bonus. And, probably not far behind that is you might be shown the door.
Okay. And talking about bonuses, like what % of someone's base would they then be striving for as their bonus?
Yeah, so look, it depends on level. If you're a recent graduate and you join these companies, your bonus target might be anything from, say, 0 to 10 or 0 to 20% of your base salary, which, sounds pretty good to most people. Once you get up into the senior executive ranks, it's probably in the range of 0 to 100%, maybe 0 to 200% of your base salary. And so, you start to think of the bonuses the major part of your cash compensation. They're a very unreliable part of your cash compensation because it doesn't just depend on your personal performance, but it also depends on the company's performance. And obviously you're somebody who might have some influence on that, but you don't completely control that.
Okay, but that kind of makes sense at an executive level that the bonus targets would be that high, right? And that's not specific to tech necessarily. But what about like a senior engineer? Like they need to be invested in what they're building. And the way that we do that is by giving them shares. That's another part of comp we've not really mentioned, shares or bonus. Like do you find that mid-range gets pretty well looked after in that sense as well to get them bought into what they're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And, salaries go up very, very quickly in US tech from the junior salaries where, you're an engineer and you're perhaps starting your first role at a place like a TikTok. You might be getting a base salary of, say, $150,000 US, which sounds good by any international standards. And then once you're in the door, if you're somebody who delivers, hits those targets, keeps getting bonuses, I mean, you could certainly over a period of years be, getting paid up around $1 million to be an individual contributor, somebody who's sitting there writing software every day.
Yeah, guys, I picked the wrong career path. Well, who knows where podcasting will take me, but sometimes I feel I went to an all-girls school and we were sort of pushed if you were into science that you'd do medicine, and if not, don't bother with science. And there was a big gap when it came to things like software, computer engineering, maybe it would have been called. And I think my school missed a trick.
Yeah, I think most schools miss a trick. And I mean, we should talk about our charity code for schools at some point and what we're trying to do here in Australia to change that trajectory, particularly for girls. But lots of schools don't understand how important tech is and how much, one engineer can change the world. I mean, you really can work on a product that affects billions of people. And there's really very few industries where that's the case. And so, it's a pretty interesting career to get into. And because of that leverage, that impact, you can make lots of money for yourself too.
Well, think about Jonathan Medine, right? We had him in episode 5-ish of season 1, and he just spent one night coding, invented the swipe right, and that's literally changed the face of modern dating. So it's definitely not an over-exaggeration to talk about that impact. And I have many a time considered retraining. Think about it all the time. This episode's giving me some more pause for thought on that as well. And I think just while we're on the topic of the sort of gender split, which we don't need to get into in too much detail, but one thing I have heard is that the female engineers that do exist, because they're sort of famously, it's more of a male skewed industry, but they can demand some pretty big salaries because the big companies have quotas or they want more female engineering presence. And so if you're a strong female engineer, you can sort of go in and demand your price and they'll be really fighting for you.
Certainly all the organizations that I've worked in, and this concludes in recent times, are probably at least 90% male and, maybe around 10% female. And that's, clearly that's not representative of, how the world is. And so I think more diversity would be fabulous in tech. And certainly, you have to encourage women to get into tech, and then those women who get into tech and who are great at tech, everybody wants them quite reasonably.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, girl power. So back to shares. Does that not dilute the shareholding of a company if they're just giving loads of free shares out to all their employees, or is it not quite as simple as that?
It does create dilution in the shares, but probably not to a significant extent unless you're really talking about founders who are getting, big parts of the company. But it's a very, very important part of the compensation of anybody in the US. And there's really 3 components to the comp in West Coast tech, Hannah. And, even young engineers are pretty savvy about those. So, first of all, there's your base salary. That's the cash you get every bi-weekly, as they'd say in the US. The bonus, we talked a little bit about that. Young engineers will be interested in what's the target bonus and what do I have to do to get it? Do you ever pay more than the target bonus? Those kinds of things. And then there's the RSUs, the restricted stock units, the shares, if you like, of the company. And most engineers will build a little spreadsheet and they'll say good, better, best. They'll put in some possible stock prices, share prices that might be reached. They'll build out the vesting schedule of those shares and they'll figure out how much they could be potentially worth. And that's certainly a really big factor in the decision-making process of engineers is, do they believe in the future prospects of the company and will they make a lot of money out of their shares?
And RSUs, or at least my experience with them, was that they vest over a certain number of years. So it's like, oh, great, we've given you this huge slug of shares, but you've got to stay here 4 more years to get them all.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little bit more complex than that too. So let's take a fictional example. So imagine you join a company and they give you 10,000 RSUs as an award when you join. So they say, here you go, you can have 10,000 shares. What will typically happen is that they'll vest out over a 4-year period. There's often sort of a cliff before you get the first part. So it might be say, hey, you have to be here 6 months before you're going to get any, and then you'll get 6 months worth. And then maybe they'll vest every month after that until you reach the 4 years and you've got all 10,000. But then what will happen every year, usually in these established companies, is they'll give you another share award. So they'll say, hey, Hannah, you've been fantastic. We're going to give you 14,000 shares this year. And again, they'll vest out over 4 years. And so now you've got lots of vesting going on. You've got the awards you got on the first day you joined, and then you've got some award that you got on the 365th day, the anniversary of your joining. And then guess what happens next year? We'll give you another pile. And so you've got all these things vesting on different schedules, different numbers of shares.
Different share price fluctuations, right? Because if there was you always want shares on a down year if you believe in the company, because that's where you're going to make most of your money.
Absolutely. So often what they'll do is, as you say, is they'll say, well, we want to give Hannah a certain dollar value worth of shares. And so they'll divide that by the current share price to get whether it's 10,000 shares or 12,000 shares. And so you're factoring in, the future prospects of the company, the number of shares you might get, but you've got this very complex equation going on in your head. They call it the golden handcuffs, because whenever you leave, you lose all of those shares that are yet to vest.
And arguably the best share play is to go for like a super early phase startup that you just believe in, right? Like I had an old colleague once who that was his whole thing. Like we were on a grad scheme together and he was like, my next move, I'm going to go early phase, be the single digit employee number, and then I'm going to make a ton of money once that goes big. But basically, if you're really good at spotting, the next unicorn, that could, you could make your retirement by the time you're 30. But I imagine that there's more people who don't than do who take that approach.
Absolutely. And different, it's just about different levels of risk appetite, right? So there's certain people who are happy to go for that hero or zero company where, it's either going to be like nothing at all, or maybe you'll make a fortune. And there's a certain set of people, and I probably fall into that category, who are happy to work for big tech. You get a generous base salary, you get a predictable bonus, you get some RSUs or stock units that are going to be worth, roughly in this kind of range, unless something special happened. And something special has happened over these last few years as the share prices of the Magnificent Seven have run up spectacularly.
All of this must amount to quite a distinct culture in Silicon Valley, and I'm sure in other sort of tech hubs that exist elsewhere in the world. But like, it sounds like these people might be a little bit, I don't know, like maybe arrogant, which isn't a word I would normally associate with like engineering, sort of studious types. But it's kind of crazy that they would be making all this money and be in this bubble where it's normal to get all this sort of compensation. And it's quite distinct from the real world that most of us live in.
Yeah. And I recommend the TV show Silicon Valley if you kind of want to see a caricature version of this. It's pretty funny. But yeah, certainly, I mean, when I was a kid, I was just kind of some nerdy geek. And then when you move to Silicon Valley, you're part of a population of people like you, and, you feel a little bit like a rock star given the money that you're getting paid and where you live and all the things that you can do with that kind of money.
Okay, so this episode is now sounding like a pretty strong endorsement for people becoming software engineers. But what about the disruption of something like Claude Code? Like suddenly you've got a much cheaper way of generating that output. Even if you don't remove all of the engineers, you remove 50% of them, 70% of them, then it's much cheaper to use that. And then your big ticket salaries and compensation and benefits packages might just disappear.
Look, I think that's partly true and partly not true. And I think it's a little bit unclear exactly where this is all headed. But if we wound the clock back, say 6 months, I had the very strong view that, things like Claude Code were kind of generating, code that could be used in prototypes to demonstrate a concept, but it really wasn't useful beyond that. So everybody's quote unquote vibe coding up these apps and then saying, hey, software engineering isn't too hard. And I'm like, try getting that running at scale where you have 99,000 queries a second.
Okay. And then 6 months ago, you're thinking,
good for prototyping.
Yeah.
And good for prototyping in a super cool way. Like we spoke about product management back in season 1, I think it was our second episode. I think even 6 months ago, my advice to young product managers is don't turn up with slides, don't turn up with diagrams, don't turn up with PowerPoints, turn up with a demo. Like you can, even if you're not a really proficient coder, you can vibe code up a demo to demonstrate any feature or any product idea that you have. So turn up with something that works.
I love that. That's really cool.
Yeah. And I think we should expect that of product managers today. 100%. It's like, go build it. If you think it's real, build it and show me the demo. There's even a course now at CMU, Carnegie Mellon University, called Vibe Founding.
And what does that mean?
So the idea is, you have a startup idea, and within a week or two of running in this class, you actually come out with a product that's actually launched and running and has a business model.
I love that. That sounds way more interesting than the medieval French literature that I studied at university. That sounds great. And so I think you're building to telling me that since 6 months ago, your attitude's changed on that, right? Like I heard in the round that one of the latest Claude models has really changed the game in terms of the quality of the output that the LLMs are giving.
Yeah, it's changed so much and in a way that I just did not predict. So I'm starting to think, Hannah, that coding by hand may be a thing of the past. We may not need to do that anymore.
That's big.
Yeah, and certainly I'm struggling to find cases where something like Claude Code can't do the work. I even heard from a friend the other day, maybe this is rumor down the mill, but that Microsoft has now mandated that every software engineer needs to use Claude Code who works at Microsoft.
Well, I mean, if it's that good and it enhances productivity, that makes sense. But then is this sort of darker undertone as that means you need fewer engineers, right?
Yeah, well, the question is what's software engineering, right? And I think, I like analogies. We use a lot of those throughout the show. But what I would say is it's a little bit like power tools for the carpenter. Mm-hmm. The average carpenter's got a nail gun, they've got an electric saw, these kinds of things. They plug batteries into things. Things are just a lot faster and a lot easier, and they can do a more professional job. And I would say things like Claude Code are a little bit like power tools for the carpenter. But I'd say that software engineering is even broader than that. It's more like building.
Yes, we did. Yeah, we talked a little about this, like the architecture, the plans.
Yeah. So I think, do you need software engineers? Absolutely you do. But will they be coding as much? Probably not. And so then I guess the question becomes, do we need as many software engineers given they spent so much time coding? So I think it's yet to play out. I think probably the answer is that the best software engineers are going to be paid even more and going to be very, very valuable. But I think that band that's not so great today, I think, could be in a little bit of trouble.
And doesn't what you described potentially blur the line between product management and engineering even more?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if I was giving advice to a young person today, I'd say become a product manager who understands data science.
Yes.
And vibe code like crazy.
Yeah. Before LLMs entered the scene, there was a lot of companies that were like offshoring engineering capability to low-cost countries. I think like India is the main one that I know of. I actually have a friend, he's a listener, who is a software engineer, and he works with a team in India and he has teams in the UK. And he says he directs different type of work to the teams because the Indian engineers have like less context, but they can just churn stuff out really quickly, which is really helpful. But do you see that being disrupted by the LLMs?
I think massively so. These folks who work in these remote geographies, given really specific tasks, really are mostly just coding.
Yeah.
Right. So they're not really doing the whole software engineering process. They're just asked to fix this piece of code, write this module, whatever else it is. And that can pretty easily be done by tools like Claude Code today. I think that's dramatically going to change.
Yeah. Just to be clear, it's not because they can't do that software engineering piece. It's just that the way tech companies have set up their offshore arms is that they give very specific like to-do lists to people who aren't as embedded in the product. And so, yeah, it sounds like that's the thing that might end up pretty disrupted. Or, I guess you could say it's enhanced, right? You'll get a lot more productivity, but it just means that there will be fewer jobs to generate the same amount of output.
Yeah, or there's more companies created, more happening in tech, and those people are deployed into those new companies and new spaces. So we'll see.
Tell you what, though, you hear these stories where I think I know some people, this has actually been true. People have more than one job. So if you're in one of these sort of remote engineering jobs, there's like good history of, it's probably not just engineering, but it's probably an easy one to sort of fake that they'll have more than one job and they'll just be like pretty productive overall and sort of be able to fudge doing two different jobs at the same time. And I guess once you have this enhanced productivity expectation, it might be harder to fudge that through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure there's already people lying in hammocks across the world with lots of agents doing all the coding for them and sending bills to people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of fair enough if you can get away with it. Maybe that's a bit morally grey, but like at work, my line is kind of like, if I can't tell that you've used ChatGPT or something similar, then I actually don't really mind. It's just that when the output is, the M dashes that you, it's a real give. Like if you can tell someone's used it, then they've not done it well enough. But if you can build code and bill people for it in a way that, you're getting great return on your time in the hammock, I think that's fair enough until, why does it matter if the person gets the code that they need at a price that they think is fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, LLMs are great for two things. One is to sort of stimulate the thinking in the first place before you actually do the thinking and then get on with the task. Or, if you've done all the thinking, you've thought it through and you just want to, correct the English, write that as a paragraph, turn those bullets into a sentence, whatever it is, then, power to you.
Yeah. Power to you. Okay. And I feel like, is it fair to say that the cadence of change in Silicon Valley or big tech in general is just getting quicker and quicker as we go because the world just moves faster nowadays?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, AI is super disruptive. LLMs are super disruptive. And so there's certainly been unprecedented change in the last few years after what I think was a period of lull. But if you look back far enough, we had mobile, the smartphone, that was a pretty big revolution. We had the personal computer was a pretty big revolution. So cloud computing was arguably as big a revolution, though a little bit slower on the boil. But certainly we've always had periods of revolution followed by periods of stability, but we're certainly going through one of those periods of revolution right now.
Interesting. So don't retrain as a software engineer just yet. Get into data science.
Yep.
Okay, so let's just take a big step back out to round off this episode, which is why does big tech matter? Like if you're not interested in being a part of this industry, then it just sounds like a bunch of young people making more money than they have sense to deal with. But there's some pretty significant geopolitical impacts these days from big tech, right? So the obvious one is if Taiwan's invaded by China, that which we mentioned up front, that could cause some pretty significant disruption to tech supply chains, which will affect everyone's life, by the way, guys, because everything is underpinned by tech now. But also just things like the latest US administration's approach to, well, basically everything. But I've heard some sort of European tech leaders casting some doubt over whether they should be using the big cloud service providers out in the US because they just don't know what's going to happen.
A lot of conversations right now about sovereign AI capability. So, a lot of countries thinking, hey, we should have our own AI capability that's totally walled within our borders so that we control this infrastructure, we control what it can do, we can make sure that the laws that we have are applied, we can make sure that our data stays in our country. So certainly lots of discussions about that right now. And I think governments and institutions are getting more and more uncomfortable with the idea that their data could be stored anywhere in the world and, stored even in the US.
Yeah, I think I saw France the other day were the latest country to announce for them what was a significant investment in AI, although I think the context in which it came up, someone was saying, yeah, it sort of pales in comparison to what these big US tech companies are making. And I guess that's where it becomes difficult to establish yourself. If you're a country that wants to play in this pond, right, which I'm sure everyone does for reasons we've mentioned, if you're not well established with the capability or the investment in it, you're starting basically on the back foot.
You need the intellectual capital, you need the actual capital to really invest, you need to go and find people and get them to stay, have the right regulatory environments, all these kinds of things, the data center infrastructure. So, very, very hard to replicate something like West Coast tech, anywhere in the world. And indeed, if you go back to the Magnificent Seven, mate, it's a good way to round out the show. The market cap of each one of those is more than the GDP of, most nations on Earth.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Like they make up 30% of the S&P 500, which on a global scale is, outsized again. And anyone that's investing in like an index fund, if you're chucking your pension or some of your savings into an index tracker or something like that, you're going to be investing in these companies. So you kind of can't get away from them.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. Well, apologies if any of you listened to that on your morning commute and you're wondering if you've made the right career choices.
But thank you for listening. And we love all of our listeners out there who listen to the Tech Overflow podcast. You can find us on socials. We are on LinkedIn. We're on X. We're on Instagram. We're also on TikTok.
We are on TikTok, guys.
Yeah,
Time to get an account.
And YouTube Shorts. So you can find us all over the web. And if you want the old school version, techoverflowpodcast.com. And we're, of course, available on all of the podcast services.
And if you like what you've heard today, do recommend the podcast to your friends and family. Give us a like, subscribe, and leave us a review. We love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. Go to Apple Podcast, write a review if you really want to say thanks for the podcast.
And guys, you heard it here first. It's time to retrain as a data scientist. So I better go and look that up now.
Yeah, awesome. I'll help you, Hannah.
Awesome. Let's go and do that. Thanks, guys.
Thank
See you next week.
See you soon. Bye.